If it's Sunday, it's Wrestling Night in America here on pwtorchdailycast.com and on the PW Torch YouTube page. I am Pro Wrestling Torch columnist Greg Parks, and we actually have now entered July here on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us here, a late night after AEW Forbidden Door on Wrestling Night in America. Happy to have you along. I'm being joined, as usual, on these pay-per-view post shows by pwtorch.com contributor Brandon LeClair. We'll welcome him to the show as well. Brandon, thank you once again for joining me here tonight.
Of course, glad to be here.
And this is an interactive show. So if you are watching live on YouTube, we'd love to have your comments in the chat. We'll react to those as we go through. You can always email us, wnialivecast@gmail.com. Got my phone handy. So I'll be keeping an eye on the email throughout the night in case anyone wants to shoot us an email that maybe can't participate in the chat for whatever reason. And of course, we do this through Pro Wrestling Torch, pwtorch.com/govip is where you can sign up to be a VIP member, and we hope you do if you are not already. So, Brandon, without any further ado, all in, we're going to talk about each of the matches on the card. We're going to try to fit in a short Money in the Bank preview because Wrestling Night in America will be back next weekend. We post Money in the Bank show on Saturday. So we don't even have a special preview show dedicated to that like we did with Forbidden Door last week. But Brendan, overall thoughts on Forbidden Door tonight?
Yeah, I think this was certainly on the lower end of AEW pay-per-views for me, and that's sort of that's not necessarily like a huge complaint because by and large, despite my often the amount of displeasure I have with week to week product for AEW, I generally think that they knock it out of the park when it comes to pay-per-views. And I think there's been very few exceptions in company history where I felt like they haven't done that. Tonight is certainly one of those times, and I think a lot of it goes back to the fact that I am just not particularly invested in this concept as a whole. Generally speaking, I wish that it were more of a themed episode of Dynamite. I think that they might get more out of it in that respect because it doesn't seem to match up in terms of hype and promotion and general intrigue as the rest of their shows on the calendar. And I thought tonight suffered from that. I thought that, as you kind of alluded to before we came on the air, Greg, that there were probably a few more misses than we're used to with AEW shows. And I thought that the main event in particular really had to do heavy lifting here.
Yeah, I kind of talked about how this was kind of a microcosm of how I'm feeling about AEW, this Forbidden Door show. It was really good in certain parts, and there were some parts that were misses for me. Not that they were maybe even actively bad. Whatever they were going for just didn't connect with me, and that's kind of how I feel about AEW as a weekly television product these days too. Is there's a lot of really good stuff in there, but there's more stuff that doesn't connect as much as it used to for me these days. So I thought Forbidden Door kind of was more in line with that. I think I like the concept of Forbidden Door a little more than you do. I think it's lost a little bit of its luster because some of the main folks that we used to love Forbidden Door for, like Will Ospreay, like Kazuchika Okada, we're seeing
Mhm.
each week on AEW television. So some of the big stars that we used to look forward to Forbidden Door to see walk through that forbidden door have already done so and are a weekly presence. So you're starting to see some repeats. I thought they did keep it fresh here with Naito and Shingo Takagi and Mina Shirakawa, Stephanie Vaquer. So they did use some new talent here for Forbidden Door that maybe they have not utilized or leaned on as much in the past couple shows. But I totally get if this show is not your cup of tea.
Yeah, and I think you kind of hit on one of the major issues here in that AEW has gone on such a spending spree in terms of obtaining high level, high profile talent that formally would come in on a one off show like this. That a lot of the stars that people are hoping to see on these shows are now under contract with the company. And so they no longer need to, open the forbidden door, so to speak. I think that this year in particular, I noticed a lack of urgency in introducing characters and building these matches. You saw, with very few exceptions, a lot of these matches just thrown together at the last minute, with very little behind them. Of course, they did a decent job with the two women's matches, but Stephanie Vaquer wasn't featured on television all that much, or at least on Dynamite, where the majority of your audience is watching. They did, like I said, a decent job with Mina Shirakawa, but then you had other situations like John Moxley and Tetsuya Naito, for example, which suffered, in terms of match quality, but also in terms of a crowd that was, one, burnt out, and two, wasn't particularly invested in this as a feud or a program. And this is a world championship for a major company. So that kind of put a damper on things. And I think you look up and down the card, MJF and Hechicero, for example, there just isn't anything there to sink your teeth into. Orange Cassidy and Sabre Jr. All of these matches were fine in execution and on paper, but they felt like exhibitions, something that I could have seen last week on Dynamite or next week on Dynamite, and it would have been just as effective.
I think that's an interesting point about some of these wrestlers who are not on TV and were not built up, or really we didn't have the time to get a full length feud. And the obvious reason for that is you can't fly in Tetsuya Naito from Japan every week, nor can you have him
Mhm.
stay in the United States for 3 weeks or a month to build up properly a match with John Moxley. So when you have the Forbidden Door concept and you have wrestlers coming from other countries like Japan, like Mexico, even like Australia, maybe even, it is more difficult because they're just not going to get the TV time. You need to rely a lot more on video packages, and we know that's not been something that Tony Khan has preferred to do historically. Is take TV time to utilize video packages. Although they
Mhm.
did a few leading up to Forbidden Door, and also, you mentioned the crowd, Brandon. I want to ask you about that before we get into the match by match here. What was your take on the crowd? Because they were hot for MJF right off the bat, and I thought, okay, smart way to start the show, get the crowd off on the right foot. And then they were kind of all over the place, kind of like the show itself, right? They were strong in some parts, certainly the main event. I mean, this was a crowd that if you gave them something to sink their teeth into, they were all in. Whether it was chanting against Boston in the Mercedes Monet match, or chanting, or just being into the main event. I mean, they seemed to want to get into stuff, but there were also pretty big lulls where they weren't reacting to much. So, what was your take on the crowd?
Yeah, I think as you pretty astutely pointed out, there were significant lulls throughout the course of the night because of the style of the action, the pace of the action, the quality of the matches, and the quality of the build related to the matches. I was chatting with Frank Pettiani, PW Torch contributor, throughout the night, who was in the building in Long Island and isn't able to join us tonight, but was kind enough to be texting me throughout the show with the live perspective, and he was echoing a lot of the sentiments that you laid out, Greg. That it was a good crowd, an engaged crowd. They were ready to come alive for things that mattered, but there just wasn't that much that mattered. And so they reacted accordingly. I mean, I think you heard that they were an invested crowd based on, the reactions that the main event got, that the anti-Boston chants got during the Vaquer and Mercedes Monet match, MJF getting a huge pop. But by and large, the build and the intrigue in the matches themselves weren't there as strongly as I think we're used to seeing with AEW pay-per-views, and therefore the crowd didn't feel like they needed to, rise to the level that we're accustomed to seeing them at.
Just a couple comments I want to highlight here. Decent Forbidden Door, but not amazing. Yeah, I'll drink to that. Tony Storm match and the main event were my favorites. Yep. Another one. I love the show, but it's too damn long. to cut some matches from the show. Malcolm, I think we're gonna lose that argument. I think we
Preaching to
can
the
make that
choir.
argument. We yeah, we can make that argument every month, but I think it's falling on deaf ears. And BJ says, I agree. I couldn't get invested in Moxley versus Naito. Love both guys, but there was no build, so didn't feel invested. So, yeah, I mean, especially if you're not a New Japan fan, so you're not seeing that side of the build.
Mhm.
Which there wasn't a ton of it, but it was the match was set up through a New Japan show. So, you're missing that aspect of it, even if you're watching the video packages. Chris checking in here, one of the best pay per views. Uh, all the matches delivered, and there was a lot of variety. So I've seen other opinions, Brandon, online that people love this show. So let's go through. We'll go through. We'll get a few plugs in here. Before I forget, we did get a couple emails just in the first few minutes of the show, but you can always email us, WNIA at gmail.com. So I want to plug that. We're here every week, by the way. Wrestling Night in America, weekly show, weekly daily cast here on the PW Torch YouTube page. So usually it's Sundays at 8 p.m. Eastern. But again, like tonight, like next week after Money in the Bank, we'll be going on the air right after those major events go off the air. Like, comment, subscribe to the channel, please, and thank you. You're doing us all a favor by doing that. I feel like there's one more plug I wanted to get in, and of course, be a part of the show. We've got a lot of people listening live here, so thankful for you for tuning in to us. I know there's a lot of post shows out there that you could be listening to, so it means a lot that you're taking the time to listen to Brandon and I here. Type your questions in the chat, and just like we just did, we will try to get to some of the more pertinent ones. So we'll skip over the pre-show matches because I'm of the opinion that I don't watch pre-show matches with very few exceptions because the show is too long anyway. So in order to not make this show too long either, because we'll already be going deep into the night, we'll skip right to the main show. And we started, Brandon, with MJF versus Hechicero. I thought the same thing you did as you talked about some of these matches, how, and I think you even mentioned the MJF match, how it could have been done on an episode of Dynamite or an episode of Collision. This match, you were kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop a little bit. Like, okay, MJF wins. What's going to happen next? What's going to make this
Mhm.
pay per view worthy? And, nothing happened. It was MJF, it was Long Island. So, that they wanted to, have him on the show. But I think best case scenario for me, Brandon, this was starting the build of MJF back into main title contender, right? Because he's been off TV for so long, rather than throwing him right into the title picture because you've already got something meaningful going on with Will Ospreay and Swerve. They're kind of building him back up so by the time All In rolls around, he's going to be ready and heated up for that major match. That's about the best that I can come up with for why to do an MJF versus Hechicero match on a major pay-per-view. So tell me if that sounds reasonable or what your take on this match was.
I just saw it as a way to get MJF on the card in front of his hometown. I don't know that they would have bothered with this if Forbidden Door had been elsewhere. I mean, maybe we get an MJF promo or something akin to that. I think that this was strictly a crowd move, a goodwill move to ensure that they were going to kick the show off with something that the crowd would be hot for, and not because of the match itself, but because of MJF and what he means to that city and what he means, frankly, to the company. I think it was a smart move. I thought the match was fine. I mean, nothing to write home about. It was a a departure for AEW where they don't sort of go balls to the walls in the opener. I thought that this felt closer to a WWE strategy where you don't necessarily put an incredibly uh, like an incredibly hot match on first, but you do bring out a hot character that you know is going to get the crowd riled up and put them in an advantageous position to set them up nicely for the rest of the show. And I thought they did that. I mean, served its purpose. MJF gets a clean, decisive win, and they moved on from it pretty quickly.
And as Chris mentioned, added a way for CMLL to introduce AEW and the Forbidden Door concept. We've seen AEW working a lot with AAA on this Forbidden Door concept, so it doesn't hurt to have a CMLL presence on the show. You're working with that group in Mexico as well, which can get tricky politically, as we've seen in the past. So yeah, I mean, it was a decent match. I'm not, you know, was it that much of a styles clash? Maybe a little bit. But it just felt like you said, a match to get MJF on the show, a match to get MJF a win on pay-per-view heading into what they're already teasing to be kind of a big match for him at All In.
Yeah, for sure.
The second match was probably my disappointment of the night. This was Okada and the Young Bucks, the Elite, against Hiroshi Tanahashi and the Acclaimed. I think part of the issue here is we've become accustomed to the Young Bucks high flying antics. Look, they're getting older. They're going to slow down. Probably smart for them not to break out all of their big moves in every match, especially now that AEW is doing more and more pay per views. Take it down a notch a little bit. But you have Okada now, who is part of the Elite, and he's a heel. So, he's not going to go balls to the wall necessarily every match either, because that's not what his heel persona calls for. It's not what the Young Bucks heel personas call for. So you have those three wrestling a different style because of their heel personas. You have Tanahashi, who has been forced to tone it down because of his injuries, and the injuries and the knee issues show up in every match he has now. You can't even hide them in 6-man tag matches anymore. And you have the Acclaimed, which is a great act, but they're not exactly known for their in-ring prowess. So um, maybe I was expecting too much, but Brandon, to me, this was the disappointment of the night. I just thought this was kind of a goofy match that didn't feel. I think Wade Keller and Keller's his recap said it never really felt that serious, and I think that was kind of how I felt about it too.
No, it certainly didn't. It felt like sort of a comedic reprieve for the show, which it almost makes me think, they could have put it on later as sort of a break for the crowd, because the crowd really didn't seem to be invested all that much in anything other than Kazuchika Okada and the possibility of seeing him work with Tanahashi, which we got a little bit of at the end and a lot of teasing earlier on. I mean, I commend Okada for the level of commitment he has to this heel character, but they're still fighting such an uphill battle with this. And that's not to say that I'm necessarily advocating for Okada to be in a babyface role right now. I think that what they've done with him, generally speaking, is smart, but it is really tough to get the reactions that they are wanting to get when these crowds, especially knowledgeable crowds who do have a general knowledge and appreciation for the New Japan product, are just so excited to see to see Okada in person. So it's really challenging for them to get the reactions that they want. The Acclaim didn't seem to garner much reaction at all until Caster's rap that brought him around a little bit, and then they were into them enough to get by. But Frank kind of echoed, in his live thoughts, what I was saying here, that the crowd just wasn't invested into anything other than seeing Okada and Tanahashi face off, which we just got so little of that it felt like a meaningless exhibition, because at the end of the day, the Acclaimed have already earned an AEW tag team title match, and that feels like the match that should have been on pay-per-view, not an exhibition six-person.
Was the lack of a crowd reaction and just the general feeling about this match a symptom of the Young Bucks' new characters maybe not clicking the way that you would expect them to?
I think that there is still some general, I want to say resentment, but you heard it tonight. I mean, both the Young Bucks and Jack Perry got CM Punk chance, which is a byproduct of the situation from a couple of months ago where they chose to show the all in footage. It doesn't feel to me like they've fully recovered from that, and I think that there's still some sort of tongue in cheek in the crowd's reaction, because at the end of the day, they're appreciative of the Young Bucks for creating this company and this product that they love, but they're willing to play along with the heel character to a certain extent. But at the end of the day, it's the issue that AEW has had for a long time now, in the sense that I don't think anyone is taking anything seriously. So they're playing along, they're in on the joke to boo the Young Bucks, but when push comes to shove, they like the Young Bucks. They love Kazuchika Okada. So nothing, there's no investment. There's a surface level, like, har har, we're playing along with the joke, but we don't really buy this.
Moving on to match number 3, Bryan Danielson over Shingo Takagi in the Owen Hart Cup tournament first round matchup. So this was a match that I know a lot of people were looking forward to. I was looking forward to this. I thought it paid off tremendously. I think if there was one complaint again, and this is a theme now with big Bryan Danielson matches, is the selling of a serious injury. And I don't think as many people bought it this time as have bought that in the past as something that is legitimate. Do you think, first of all, your thoughts on the match itself and the quality of it, but does the Danielson injury teases add something to his matches?
Absolutely not. I'm vehemently opposed to these injury spots. This one was nowhere near as egregious as the one with Osprey a couple of months ago, obviously, and this one seemed pretty clear to be a work, just based on the general reactions and the way that Aubrey Edwards reacted to it. But it hasn't always been that way. I think in the past they've gone out of their way to make you feel like it was real, and I've gone on the record in saying that it cheapens what have been really, really incredible reactions to, and really incredible matches and incredible reactions to those matches. Because take the Osprey and Danielson match a couple months ago, for example. People were absolutely ecstatic that they had just witnessed what a lot of people thought was one of the best matches ever. And then the elation and the excitement of that moment is immediately quelled by the disappointment and the fear and just the general uh, eh, just worry for Bryan Danielson's health. I don't like that they exploit his multitude of legitimate real life injuries. I don't think that it helps his matches. I don't think that it helps tell the stories that he's trying to tell. I just think that it's cheap. It's preying on the real life emotions of people and taking them out of the escape that they're trying to obtain by watching an excellent pro wrestling match. So it's Bryan Danielson's one of my favorite wrestlers, and it's one of my least favorite things that happens in pro wrestling right now. And so tonight was no different. I thought it was completely unnecessary, but it was thankfully tonight it felt as though it was a little bit more on the nose, in the sense that it was clear to me at an earlier point that this was just a selling tactic. I think maybe because it was in the middle of the match and not at the end, that could have aided it. But Aubrey Edwards really is the one that clued me in that it was, all okay. So not a fan of that. But aside from that issue, I thought it was a really good match, best match of the night to this point in the show, and I'm genuinely intrigued to see Brian move through the tournament. It feels like this could be a really big opportunity to get him in a main event position at Wembley. And even if that isn't the end goal, I think that however he is to be eliminated from the tournament en route to that will set up the next couple of months for him on AEW TV.
I think it was important to put one of the first round matches on pay-per-view just to help the visibility of this tournament and to help make it feel like a big deal. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm of two minds of it, because I think that it might have felt a little bit more important had it been a second or third round match that was going to be on pay per view. but just given the time frame where they are with the tournament, it makes sense. And it worked in the sense that, it's an interpromotional matchup. So it's not just thrown on there out of nowhere. But it did suffer from what I think most of this card suffered from, which was the fact that it was really, with few exceptions, just a bunch of matches.
And another one of those bunch of matches is next, Toni Storm defeating Mina Shirakawa to retain the AEW Women's Championship. This was a really good match. I think it lived up to my expectations. This was one of the matches I was most looking forward to on this show. You kind of got the thought that Mariah May would play a part in the finish such that it would lead to potentially building or the start to the build of Storm versus May for All In. But probably if you had to ask me what I thought the least likely scenario at the end of the match would be, it's that all three would leave together. It was always, is Mariah May going to turn on Toni Storm? Is she going to turn on Mina Shirakawa? Who is she going to side with? And in the end, not only did she not turn on anyone and side with both of them, but she got Tony and Mina together and to be on the same side as well. So I was surprised about that. Not terribly disappointed. I mean, I think that's kind of like the best use of the Forbidden Door. Have someone come in and tell the story and have them leave happily ever after. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as Shirakawa did. So what did you think of the match? And then the fact that Mariah May didn't turn on anyone, is that disappointing to you in any respect that they didn't advance the story any further quite yet?
No, definitely not. AEW has a tendency to do swerve on top of swerve on top of swerve, and we've seen pay-per-views in the past where it feels like every match is a swerve on top of a swerve on top of a swerve. So I love the fact that most of this show and this match in particular was very straightforward. They told the story that they wanted to tell. They teased the issues between Mariah May and Mina and Tony Storm, and when all was said and done, everybody went home happy. I mean, I thought that it worked for the type of character that both Mina and Tony Storm play. If this were a different scenario with different wrestlers, I think you would have had a harder time making it believable. But Mariah May has been so likable in this role. Mina has been so likable since coming in as one of the participants in Forbidden Door, and Tony Storm is finally receiving permission, it seems, from the company to play into the babyface character that the fans want her to be. So I thought this worked all the way around, and I think it also was smart from a booking sense, because if they're not going to have Mina around, then what is the point of deepening a blood feud between she and Tony, or having Mariah turn on Tony to side with Mina if Mina's just not going to be around going forward?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's always something you could set up for the future. With AEW's
Mhm.
relationship with Stardom, it doesn't necessarily mean we've seen the last of Mina Shirakawa. So they
Sure.
could have been really playing the long game there, setting something up. BJ says Tony match was my favorite actual storyline with great characters. Hey, I agree. Mina is one of the Forbidden Door entrants, I guess, that's gotten a lot of TV time in the buildup. And she needed to, because that's what the storyline called for. You couldn't do a storyline like this of Mariah May and whose side is she on without having Mina on TV frequently. So they had her, they used her appropriately, I think, for what the storyline called for, and it made everything a lot more well-rounded. And I think that's what stood out about this match to me, Brandon, is just how well-rounded and well-crafted the story is compared to a lot of the other Forbidden Door matches that we talked about earlier that are just kind of thrown in there. And again, understandably so, because when you're talking Forbidden Door, you're talking people in other countries. You can't just have them hop on a Delta flight and fly 2 hours to the building. But I think that ability to have Mina Shirakawa on TV and building a three-dimensional storyline for this helped make this a lot more memorable than it otherwise could have been.
Yeah, they benefited greatly from her availability. I would say that of the matches that featured wrestlers from companies other than AEW, this was hands down the most well built, and I don't think it is particularly close. And a lot of that has to do, of course, with Mina's availability going into the show, but also credit to her too, because her being as charismatic as she was and feeling enough like a star helped make this what I thought was Tony Storm's best built title defense of her reign so far, and also the best match of her title reign so far. I thought that they did a really good job with it, and you know, credit is due where it's deserved, especially considering I've been particularly hard on the AEW women's division. I think justifiably so. This run was a step in the right direction.
Well, we've had a lot of viewers tune in since we started the show. So just to kind of reset here, I am Pro Wrestling Torch columnist Greg Parks. The man beside me on the screen is pwtorch.com contributor Brandon LeClair. And this is Wrestling Night in America here on pwtorchdailycast.com, as well as the PW Torch YouTube page. So we are here with Wrestling Night in America every weekend, usually Sundays at 8 p.m. Eastern. Tonight, we're going on the air after AEW Forbidden Door to talk about that show. After all, we at Wrestling Night in America talk about the big shows in pro wrestling. So next week we'll be on the air after Money in the Bank Saturday from Toronto. So hope you'll join us after that show as well. We'll break down the matches on that show and our reactions to them. So if you're watching us live, you can submit comments in the chat. We'll show them on the screen. And you can email us, wnialivecast@gmail.com. So the fifth match, reaching the halfway point of the pay-per-view proper, was the first win by someone coming through the Forbidden Door on this show, and that was Sabre Jr. over Orange Cassidy. So Orange Cassidy really telling the story of just how difficult of a path it's been with the breakup of the best friends and now losing here. So kind of in a funk right now. But Sabre Jr. gets the victory. Brandon, how important is it to have a New Japan wrestler, a Stardom wrestler, a AAA CMLL wrestler win on these shows? We saw Zack Sabre win. We saw Tetsuya Naito win. So, of the 10 matches on the show, and granted, not all of them featured a Forbidden Door act, but there were only 2 wins by someone not on the AEW roster. Is that just kind of the nature of the beast when it's an AEW pay-per-view and they're kind of the home team in this? Or do you think that needs to be evened out a little bit in the future?
I think it's imperative that you give them some rub. I mean, it would be pretty ineffective for a show overall if the presenting company is constantly beating the stars of the co-promoting company. It would send a pretty clear message that they're not on AEW's level, and I don't think that that's the kind of partnership that these companies have or want to make it appear as though they have. So getting a couple of wins for the New Japan crew was definitely imperative. I'm not so much I'm not so much worried about them evening the score in later years. I think the way that the show is presented, it's not like the announcers are keeping track or keeping tabs or anything like that. They just kind of take it on a match by match basis. So that isn't of particular note or concern to me the way that it was, say, like with the Survivor Series presentation, where you'd have the running ticker for Raw and SmackDown and sometimes NXT. I think that this is different enough that they get by with it okay. But I certainly think that part of the reason you saw so few wins this year is because so many of the stars that AEW fans consider to be at the level of the company's own talent are now under contract with the company. So it's hard to warrant giving these other talent wins when you really don't have anyone primed in that position. I mean, now that the likes of Kazuchika Okada and Will Ospreay are under contract, it's not likely that you're going to have guys like, for example, like Tanahashi, really beating any of your AEW mainstays. Tetsuya Naito is another example, though he won here tonight. I don't think if this had been a non-title match where if this had been a non-title match where they didn't need to get the championship back on a New Japan contracted wrestler, I don't think you would have seen Naito get a big signature win here.
Yeah, and I think it's really a case by case basis, right? It depends on the matchups, depends on what wrestlers you're able to use from other companies. It depends on who
Mhm.
you have them matched up against. So it really is, as you said, no one is keeping score. AEW is not keeping, maybe behind the scenes they're keeping score, and the other companies they're working with are keeping score, but they're not keeping score on screen for the viewers, and it really is more of a case by case basis because you have all different kinds of matchups every year, and as you mentioned, in another year, when you don't have a title on the line, maybe Moxley goes overnight. So circumstances absolutely make a difference. I agree with that. Sabre versus Cassidy, the match itself, I thought it was a really nice match, well worked. Orange Cassidy again, telling the story of him just kind of going downhill a little bit. Zack Sabre Jr. taking advantage of that. I've on the record as a big Zack Sabre fan. I like what he does. The finish of this match, probably a finish I've never seen before and probably will never see again. I think where he had several submission holds in one on Orange Cassidy, and I love the reaction from the fans every time he pulled another body part back. It was like they were oohing and eyeing. So, really would have been hard to for Cassidy to get out of that one in a way that made sense to any of the viewers. But Sabre versus Cassidy, what did you think of the match there? I thought, at this point, you had Danielson, Takagi, you had Storm, Shirakawa, and you had Sabre Cassidy back to back. So I thought, as much as I wasn't really thrilled about the first two matches, you kind of feel like they were riding the ship here in the middle
Mhm.
portion of the show.
Yeah, I thought this was good. Like the Danielson Chicago match, I thought that it suffered a little bit from the exhibition quality. I mean, of course, Danielson and Chicago had the Owen Hart Cup tournament backing it, so that helped a little bit. But Sabre Jr. and Cassidy really felt like an exhibition match that didn't have a whole lot behind it because Cassidy has been so fully embroiled with this best friends thing and the Don Callis family now. So it felt a little bit out of place and a little thrown together, but they had a really nice match. I mean, I like you, Greg. I find a lot of enjoyment in Zack Sabre Jr. Matches, especially on big stages where he can really kind of like hone his craft and have some time to work in some cool holds and transitions. And to Orange Cassidy's credit, I mean, he went step for step with Sabre Jr. in a lot of ways. I mean, they did a lot of neat stuff in the early going. Crowd was a little soft in the beginning, and I think a lot of that just has to do with the style of match that they wrestled. And up to this point, we really hadn't seen any of the AEW style like chaos that we're often used to seeing in these pay-per-views. So I sensed that there was a little bit of restlessness from the crowd, but they got into it strongly enough by the end, and the that submission finish or verbal tap out was definitely really neat. And it makes sense too for Sabre Jr. to go over here and be one of the non-company guys to get a win because it's fitting for Cassidy at this point. They're telling a story with him that he is on a mental and physical downfall, both from his exhaustive international championship reigns and also, losing all of his best friends.
Yeah, and it's another one of those things when we talk about should AEW even it out a little bit more. I mean, you have to remember a lot of these wrestlers that are going through the Forbidden Door are going to be going back to their home promotion, and they're not going to be on AEW TV. So to have them win and creatively to not be able to follow up on that win makes things very difficult. So
Mhm.
this loss, as you mentioned, they're going to be able to follow up on that. It's part of a longer story with Orange Cassidy, so it makes sense to have him lose here. Match number 6 was the team of Hook, Samoa Joe, and Katsuyori Shibata defeating Chris Jericho, Big Bill, and Jeff Cobb. I mentioned on X at Greg M. Parks during this show that I kind of wished it ended up just being Samoa Joe versus Jeff Cobb in a singles match. That probably would have been my preference to this 6-man tag match. They all did hit some really cool suplexes at the end of this match to kind of bring it back around for me. But Brandon, I am just so down on the learning tree concept and this whatever this character is that Chris Jericho is doing, which gets more and more bizarre every week as to what I get further away from understanding what he's trying to go for with this character. You know, Jericho is famous for changing with the times and updating his character in ways that other wrestlers simply don't do. And he's gotten a lot of, rightfully so, compliments about that through the years. But the character has always been Chris Jericho. It's always been grounded in Chris Jericho, and there's always been an explanation for the character change. I mean, this character barely resembles the Chris Jericho that we know in terms of like there's no explanation for why he's all of a sudden talking differently, why he's waving it like I mean there's just no explanation for these quirks that Jericho has begun to take on as a character in a way that makes it any way relatable for the audience. So I know I feel like every week I come on here and complain about Jericho and the learning tree, but you know, every week they add something to make the whole idea more and more bizarre, I guess. So you know, I'll throw it to you about anything about the learning tree and then the match itself.
There have been weeks throughout this process where I thought that he might be getting it over, and it might be turning and working to his favor in the way that he wanted to. But I think I'm losing faith that that's happening, or less so completely losing faith and more so thinking that it going forward, it's going to be a city by city thing. I think in the more uh, rabid crowds, in your New Yorks and your Bostons and Chicago's, the stronger markets that AEW has, I think that you're going to continue to see this pushback where there is a there's some go away heat. I think that what Jericho was getting tonight was go away heat, but in the same breath, by and large, on weekly episodes of Dynamite, it doesn't feel like that's what's happening. It feels like a mixture of not terribly over to still a well-respected Legends act, veteran act. It varies from city to city, and I'm wondering if at some point, if one of those reactions is going to stick and catch on, and if it's this one, if it's the one that's chanting "Please retire," and all Jericho has in response is to say like, something silly like, "Oh, I'm the hometown guy tonight," for example. I don't know that that's gonna work particularly well. I mean, I like what Big Bill's doing. I mean, it's giving him some interesting character work, I guess, and he's kind of comical. He's getting to show, some of the range that he has in the ring. I think this pairing is better for him than the Ricky Starks one was, as strange as that is to say. But the Brian Keith stuff, the bad apple, that hasn't worked for me. I thought it's largely fallen flat. They needed to, write him out of this match to make it fit within the Forbidden Door concept. The late introduction of Jeff Cobb felt really senseless to me, especially after they had initially they challenged them to this trios match, and then that changed, and Jericho instead gets challenged on Wednesday on Dynamite to a singles match uh, after he thinks he's introducing his partner, and then ultimately they do the trios match anyway, and we don't get any mention of I'm blanking who was Jericho, who did Jericho want to team with him?
Minoru Suzuki.
Minoru Suzuki, that's right. So Suzuki sends the video, says he's not teaming with Jericho. He wants to face Jericho. So then it looks like Suzuki is going to face Jericho at Forbidden Door, but then it ends up being the trios match instead, and suddenly Jeff Cobb is involved. So this just felt messy from the onset. It didn't really feel like they had a clear direction of what they wanted to do or where they wanted to go. I'm intrigued by the pairing of Samoa Joe and Hook and Shibata, and I do get a kick out of Shibata's English translation. I think it's like a hokey gimmick, but it is it's pretty one note, but it can be funny. I just wish that they could get out of the Jericho vortex.
Yeah, it's going the other direction, it seems like, with Jericho getting even more on TV time,
Mhm.
walking backstage and getting multiple segments for this character. So it looks like
And they
it's going to
don't
be
need
here to
him.
stay.
There was a time where they really needed him, and
Yeah,
they just don't.
I agree, especially in this character that is not exactly compelling. Like
Mm.
if he had a compelling character, I'm all for it. Like I don't I think in certain respects Jericho has not lost a step. He can still deliver in the ring to a certain degree. I mean, he's not the Chris Jericho of old, or even 3 or 4 years ago, the Chris Jericho. He's slowed down a bit since then, but I think he's a valuable character and a valuable act when he has a character that adds value to the show. And I don't see this character being that. The ladder match for the TNT Championship. Remember that the TNT title was stripped from Adam Copeland and put up for grabs in this ladder match. It was won, perhaps not so surprisingly, by the Elite's favorite, Jack Perry, over Dante Martin, Konosuke Takeshita, Mark Briscoe, El Phantasmo, and Leo Rush. So they had some big moments. They got a head start on Money in the Bank, which is next weekend. So that's probably a plus. Now Money in the Bank matches are going to have to follow this instead of the other way around, which I think is advantageous to AEW here. Jack Perry winning, not exactly a surprise. I think it was the right move. It was the move that made the most sense, but it was also the right move. The car crash aspect of this for people who were looking forward to that part of it, I think paid off. So, I think it was the right decision. I think it was a really entertaining match for this kind. And it's been hard because we've kind of been inundated with ladder matches to a certain extent. So I think people were not over the concept at this point, but I think they were sitting back and saying, okay, another ladder match, this better be special. And I think to a lot of people, it lived up to that hype. What did you think of the match? And then Jack Perry going over.
The match was fine. I mean, I think that this suffered from what a lot of matches on this show suffered from, and that's just the lack of star power and the just inability of the crowd to get behind specific acts that really just haven't been built particularly well coming in. I mean, half of the wrestlers in this match are not really regular guys who are regularly competing for TV time. I mean, Dante Martin, like many other wrestlers in AEW, has had multiple stop-start pushes. El Phantasmo, not an AEW wrestler, not somebody who the crowd was really introduced to in any meaningful way. Leo Rush has been with the company before, now coming in as an outsider, never really established himself. So they're all able to do cool moves, and some of their cool moves got pops tonight. But really, this match was about, is the very obvious Jack Perry going to win, or are we going to kind of get the dark horse winner in Konosuke Takeshita? And we got the obvious, the Jack Perry win, which I thought was fine. I mean, he made sense, makes a lot of sense for him to win this match, to carry that title. In truth, I think that he would have gotten a lot more heat, and they could have played this a lot better if they had just allowed the Bucks to put the title on him without wrestling a match. I get why they wanted this match on the card, and perhaps the way that you do it is Tony Khan doesn't prevent the Bucks from awarding him the title, but instead forces him to defend it in this ladder match. If you're
Yeah.
dead set on getting a ladder match on the card, but I think for the purpose of maintaining heat on Jack Perry and the Young Bucks, the smartest way to do that would have been to let it go through, let him be crowned TNT champion without ever having actually won the title. So that to me was a missed opportunity, but they got where they needed to go in the end. They have a really interesting conundrum with Konosuke Takeshita, who continues to put on, otherworldly performances and get over as a babyface to a significant degree. That's two guys now under Don Callis's wings who are natural baby faces, who the crowd clearly wants to get behind and cheer in a very big way. And they're being held back by one of the only real heels that the company has.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in our main event. The eighth match on the pay-per-view, Mercedes Monet defeating Stephanie Vaquer to win the New Japan Strong Women's title, as well as retain the TBS Championship. The big story, though, came after the match when Dr. Britt Baker, DMD, returned and walked out onto the stage and sort of let it be known that she was coming after Mercedes Monet's TBS championship. Another tweet I sent out on X tonight was that I thought arguably the women were the standouts of this Forbidden Door season, that being Stephanie Vaquer and Mina Shirakawa, both from an in-ring point of view, but also from a character slash storyline point of view. And that, that's more of Mina Shirakawa than Stephanie Vaquer, who didn't have an opportunity to be on TV, although um, sending Zeuxis to face Monet, her friend, and then the follow up that they had this week, I thought was pretty strong, and was at least something that they tried to tie in with Stephanie Vaquer. So, but from an in ring point of view, I thought this is a really strong match. And then, the long awaited return, Brandon, of Dr. Britt Baker, DMD. I mean, we've been waiting for this for a long time, and certainly feels like the right opponent, that being Mercedes Monet. I feel like if you were going to bring Baker back, you want it to be in an impactful spot. And I can think of very few more impactful spots to bring her back in than facing Mercedes Monet, perhaps as early as All In.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice because since Monet has captured that title, and even dating back to Willow, the TBS title has been more of the work rate title for the women. With Tony Storm doing so much character work, it's much harder for that title to have sort of the in-ring prestige that I think that wrestlers like Willow and Mercedes are kind of going after with their presentation. So it's a little surprising that they're throwing Britt into those waters, knowing that she isn't the strongest wrestler. She's a great character and a good promo and a good act all around, but to me, she fits in a little bit better in the stories that they're telling in the women's world division right now. But that doesn't mean that it can't be successful with Monet. I'm just curious to see how they choose to align the two because Britt Baker, when she took her leave of absence from the company, she was a babyface. I think the crowd has been naturally inclined to cheer for her in her recent appearances. I don't know how much time away has changed that or softened their opinion of her, but there was definitely a tendency to want to cheer her before. And with Monet, we've seen this sort of interesting shift where she is getting generally star reactions when she comes out in a lot of cities, still solid babyface reactions. Got a solid babyface reaction tonight until like 10 minutes into the match where the crowd just suddenly flipped because of a guy in the third row in a Celtic shirt. I mean, that to me, like, That was one of my biggest disappointments of this show. I thought that Stephanie and Mercedes were working so hard, and I thought that the match was really, really strong, and by the time the Celtics guy stood up and sort of made his presence felt, it felt like the crowd kind of gave up on the women in the ring and went into business for themselves, just crapping on the Celtics and the Red Sox. And like I get that there's a connection there because Mercedes is from Boston, and night like Excalibur and Taz were trying really hard to push that point home and draw that connection. But I think Nigel was the one who like was kind of pushing back on it a little bit and saying, "Oh no, they're cheering Vaquer because they've just gotten really invested in her and they appreciate her performance." And he was trying to, keep it within the confines of the story, but it felt pretty clear that this was just sort of a weird co-opting of that entire back half of the match, and it was a bit of a bummer because I thought that they were really good, especially in the back half.
Yeah, I didn't realize at first that I think they started the switch before they got on the Celtics guy. So when they were chanting, cheering Vancouver and booing Monet, I was like, this is really interesting. Like, I wonder what it is that is Vancouver really like, kind of like what Nigel McGuinness is.
Mhm,
She captured their attention,
mhm,
and then you could see them like shouting at someone off screen behind the announcers, and you're like, oh, it
mhm.
has something to do with this, and then. So again, yeah, disappointing for sure. Starplane in the comments makes a point that DMD versus CEO could main event All Out. Now, remember, we're so focused on All In at Wembley. It's, the biggest show of the year for AEW. But just a few weeks after that, they have another pay per view, All Out, that they're going to have really fresh matches for. So some of these matches that we're considering for All In may end up getting moved to All Out and perhaps even in a more prominent position.
Yep, definitely could, and I mean, it's not a bad idea, but I go back to the argument that I think having 2 pay-per-views in that quick of succession is a poor strategy. I know that people loved All Out last year. I wasn't nearly as big on it as many other people, and I do think that you hurt your drawing power, especially in subsequent years when the bloom is off the rose, so to speak, and it's no longer, the first attempt at Wembley. Now that we're doing it every year, and in subsequent years, it's just going to be a weaker proposition in general, just because there's familiarity there now. I think that spreading your roster thin or trying to involve top acts in multiple feuds so that they feel like they are in an important situation for two completely separate pay-per-views in two markets is a poor strategy that I wish they'd get away from, but it's not what they're going to do.
As someone who has to do a 90-minute to 2-hour podcast after these shows, I agree, it is very difficult.
Mm,
Difficult on us too. So, the semi-main event was Tetsuya Naito over John Moxley to win the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. I talked about how the six-man elite match earlier in the show was probably the disappointment of the night for me. This was probably up there, Brandon. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what happened toward the end, but there was some obvious either miscommunication going on or one of them got hurt and it ended up leading into the finish. So I'm not sure if the finish came earlier than was planned because of an injury or if they just couldn't get the finishing sequence down if it was planned ahead of time. But, Naito is part of that generation of New Japan wrestlers with Okada and with Tanahashi that is gradually slowing down. And we've talked about here on this podcast, I've written about it in a Parks' take on pwtorch.com about how there is a real gap in New Japan, not talent necessarily, but in star power from this generation that is kind of phasing out and the generation that's right behind them. There does seem to be a gap there. And, in an ideal world, you have a younger, hungrier wrestler that's more able to, I don't want to say keep up with Moxley because I don't think that's an accurate depiction of what happened, but maybe you could tell the story of this young lion that's younger and has less wear and tear than Moxley and just beats him for the IWGP title, whether that's a Shota Umino or someone else. You would ideally like to have them in that position, but the fact is New Japan doesn't have that. They don't have that wrestler right there who's ready,
Mhm.
so they rely on the old guard once again, and Tetsuya Naito, who, to their advantage is going to have that title through the G1 tournament that's coming up later. We're now in July. I think it's safe to say later this month coming up. So that's going to make things easier for New Japan to have a wrestler in the tournament with the IWGP Championship. But yeah, this was another one that, I mean, it was solid in parts, and it was the old Tetsuya Naito. I don't think he's slowed down as much as some of his counterparts, but there was something going on at the end there that got screwed up.
Yeah, this one was really perplexing to me. It didn't really have much going in. They didn't do a particularly strong job building it. I think they thought that, whatever they had done on New Japan TV and their first match was enough um, to carry the weight here. Having it in the semi-main position obviously was not a favor to New Japan, but signaling that the IWGP Championship carries a great amount of weight and importance. So it was placed high on this card, but it didn't feel like a match deserving of that position. It didn't feel like it had the juice or the intrigue behind it the way that, say, a Will Ospreay or Swerve Strickland did. And it started for me right from the onset. I mean, John Moxley came out to his New Japan music, and that was a nice little touch, but the crowd seemed to want to hear Wild Thing. And like you're doing these little things, these little touches, and sometimes you just have to play the hits. And like I think that kind of got things off on the wrong foot. And then from there, it was just sort of laborious. I thought that AEW showed like a really great deal of restraint on this show. I mean, usually it is balls to the wall from opening to closing match. We're full of interference and weapons and blood and guts and gore. Like they just throw it all at you on these pay-per-views. And they didn't do that at all here. And so I thought that the reason for showing so much restraint was to build to this match. And this match was going to be the one where they kind of went all out because, like you said, Naito has very clearly lost a step. He's slowed down considerably. Moxley is a brawler. His best matches are when he is, down and dirty, gritty, brawling. Moxley bleeds in almost every single match that he has. It feels like a foregone conclusion that he's going to be busted open at this point. And instead, they just wrestled a very straightforward paint by numbers wrestling match.
And
And
Naito is a
I
good brawler too, and that
yeah,
style of match would work to his advantage
right.
given
And would
his growing limitations at this stage.
right, cover up the deficiencies. So I thought it was sort of a slam dunk that they go in that direction. And instead, I don't know if the intent was to just subvert expectation here, but I did not care for the result, and I don't think that they were helped at all by the crowd just being completely dead for this. I mean, they came alive for a couple spots near at the end, like and when Naito hit the first Destino, like there was a pop, but for the most part, this was just like you could hear a pin drop. And Frank Pettiani actually texted me pretty deep in the match, and he just said like, man, like they've got to move to a finish here. People are getting restless.
Yeah.
There was just no heat for the match at all. And so I think you wound up feeling eh, feeling disappointed for New Japan because I mean this is a major world title match for them and a world title change and the crowd was just giving them nothing.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, I think they were just reacting to the match. I think, the main event showed that the crowd still had stuff left in the tank, but it was
Mm,
kind of a show me something crowd. We'll react if you show us something, and I just don't think
mhm.
they saw enough in Moxley Naito to react to.
Yeah, for sure.
The main event, Swerve Strickland retaining his AEW championship over Will Ospreay. This was, I would say, match of the year contender for me. Just absolutely awesome in every way you could think of. These guys, my favorite part was that they would slow it down, and then they'd go boom, 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 real quick, and get the crowd to rise, and then they'd
Mhm.
slow it down a little, and then they'd go boom, boom, boom again, and then so it was a pattern, and it kept the crowd into it, and it was the ebb and flow of the match that the crowd really reacted to. And then at the end, you had Don Callis trying to get involved when the ref was bumped. Swerve, I think this is a big win for Swerve. He's really put together a couple big wins back to back pay per views now. So his for a title reign that some people thought may be shorter than the usual AEW World Title reign, I think he's impressed with some of the big victories that he's gotten. So MJF somehow gets involved, maybe coming up. Again, we have two major shows coming up for AEW in the next few weeks, with All In and followed quickly by All Out. So we'll see what they do. They could do something where they defend the title on one of those shows, but not the other, or they could defend it on both shows. It'll be interesting to see what decision is made there. But Brandon, am I too hyperbolic in saying that this is a match of the year contender?
No, I mean, definitely not. I put it in um, similar conversation to I think Danielson and Osprey from earlier in this year, which I think was, aside from the Danielson injury, I think if in terms of pure wrestling, was probably my favorite match of the year so far. So I'd put it right up there with that. I thought it was excellent. Uh, to me, the biggest talking point for this is how important this was for Swerve. Not just winning the match, but I think that Swerve Strickland's rise in AEW has been well documented, and it took him a while to get where he was. And I think that he did this organically, and a ton of credit is very much owed to him for his organic rise within the company. But I think that all this time we've been having these side conversations as it relates to Swerve, in that his rise is sort of unfortunate. The timing of it is sort of unfortunate because it's coming at the same time as the meteoric rise of Will Ospreay. And as big of a deal as Will Ospreay has been on the Indies and in New Japan, I don't know that anyone could have necessarily predicted that he would show up in AEW as a full-time wrestler day one and instantly become the biggest star in the company
Mhm.
and instantly be getting the biggest reactions in the company without exception. I mean, any given week on a Dynamite, there's nobody quite reaching the level of the reactions that Will Ospreay is getting. And so to see Swerve come up in contrast to that and realize that while his star is rising, there is this meteoric star, in some ways usurping his in on his route to the championship. And so I thought it was a calculated but risky decision to pair them up so quickly in
Yeah.
Swerve's run. And I think it paid off because there if there wasn't fear, there should have been fear that Will Ospreay just bigfooted Swerve tonight. Win or lose, whether Swerve won the match, whatever. I think that there should have been fear that Osprey could have bigfooted him and made him look a little silly as the AEW World Champion and supposed top star in the company. Instead, it felt to me like Swerve put his foot in the ground and pretty firmly said, "I am his equal. This is our company. We are the two guys. If I'm 1B, he's 1A. If I'm 1A, he's 1B. There's no number 2 here." It felt like a really definitive statement from him, both in terms of the way that he kept up with Osprey in the ring, the way that the crowd reacted to him, both in his comebacks, in his beatdowns, in his eventual win. They are all in on Swerve Strickland the same way that they're all in on Will Ospreay, and that is a really good sign for him in the company.
And I think that the interesting thing about it is, and I think, speaking for myself, I've kind of lost sight of this in the conversation of Osprey or Swerve, is you don't really necessarily have to choose.
Yeah.
This could be your Rock Austin. This could be
Hmm.
your Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels. This could be your main event rivalry for the next 5 to 10 years.
Hmm.
And I don't mean to compare them in the way that Austin and Rock were these huge stars, but just the fact that you have two big stars at the top of your card who always end up coming back to each other. You don't have to push Osprey at the top at the expense of Swerve. You can
Right.
have them both up there. So, I mean, I think that's the ideal world scenario that plays out over the next few years is this is the first of many matches that we'll see over the course of pay-per-views of Swerve and Osprey getting together for the AEW World Championship. Um, so I think you're right that a lot of the conversation has been unfortunate for Swerve that he's champion at a time of Osprey's rise, but it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be one or the other is kind of what I'm saying, and I think a little bit maybe what you're saying as well.
Yeah, I also think that it's an interesting situation that they're in too, because AEW since its inception has really been a star by committee company. They have never really committed themselves to really cementing a guy in that top echelon above the company. The closest thing that they've ever had to it was with Kenny Omega, and I still think that it was short-sighted of them to not book Kenny Omega that way, and maybe that was partially because Kenny Omega didn't want to be booked that way, but I think when AEW started 5 years ago, my thought, and a lot of people's thought, was this is going to be a vehicle to make Kenny Omega the biggest star in wrestling, or the biggest star that he can be. And instead, he very quickly assimilated into traffic, as Wade often likes to say, and became just part of a committee. And AEW has operated under that sort of system ever since. And the first time I felt like they have had an opportunity um, to sort of shy away from that formula, the first time they've had a guy truly worth investing in at that tip top level is with Will Ospreay, and now I think with Swerve Strickland too. I think that you can have a very successful roadmap for, like you said, the next 3 to 5 years if you get into the Will Ospreay and Swerve Strickland business and just accept that they are guys who are going to lead your company above the rest of your roster.
A question from the chat here: how much longer until they pull the trigger on the official Osprey Callis split? We've seen teases of it. We've heard teases of it on TV. We saw potentially a tease of it tonight. Callis always seems to be very strongly on the side of Will Osprey whenever he's asked about it. He was on commentary, I think, for Collision about it. Always has the appearance of having everything together with this group. So is it kind of a surprise, a shocker that they do soon, or do they really draw this out Mariah May, Tony Storm style?
I hope they don't. I mean, I've been on record many times on these shows saying that I think it's imperative that you get Osprey away from the Callis family as quickly as possible when you have someone who's getting these types of reactions and who's clearly cemented as a top baby face of the company. The last thing that you want to do is muddy the waters or confuse fans in any way by making him associate himself with and by nature accept sort of the moral depravity of one of the only true heels that you have in the company in Don Callis. So I think that it's really important that they move as quickly as possible to get on from this. I don't know, what the direct plan is for Osprey at All In, be it an MJF match, or if MJF goes to Swerve, or what have you. But if there's no specific plan in place, then I would say, the best use of him, short of one of those major matches, is to position him, once and for all in a blow off with someone from the Callis family, and really just put that to bed once and for all.
Got a couple emails that will kind of rapid fire through some of the questions about Forbidden Door so that we have enough time to talk about Money in the Bank. Shouldn't take long. There's only 5 matches announced so far. But the first question was from Azan, who also saw in the chat here tonight. Azan says, "Good evening, Greg and Brandon. Who should be the first to challenge Jack Perry as TNT champion off the bat?" Um, I wonder if it may be someone from that ladder match. Is it I mean, you would say Takeshita would be. I mean, Mark Briscoe probably would be the obvious one. I think that would be really interesting. I think it would be a good use of Mark Briscoe, a guy who's probably underutilized at this stage. Takeshita wouldn't work because they're both heels. So save that for Takeshita's eventual babyface turn. Maybe that will
That hasn't
it will
stopped them before,
that
though.
it's true, but we might still be talking about that eventual babyface turn a year from now. But Mark Briscoe, if you're going to take someone out of that ladder match, I think is a really strong contender. Is there anyone else, maybe not in that match, that you could think would make sense for the first challenge to Jack Perry?
The roster's so big and so segmented. I mean, Daniel Garcia is a thought if he weren't currently, involved in the other stuff with Osprey and with Max and all that. I mean, you could do something like Orange Cassidy. I mean, he's an evergreen guy that's always going to work in that general role. If you want to have him challenge for a title, if they want to bring Sammy Guevara back, I don't know if there's any talk about that, or if he'd be designated face or heel. That's always a possibility. I'm struggling to think of anyone else significant off the top of my head. I mean, you could do something like, um, if the BCC are going to be involved with the elite throughout the summer in some capacity, now that Moxley has been freed up, and Moxley's very much like a rah AEW guy, then I could see like Claudio getting involved with him. That would
I
make
like
sense.
Wheeler Yuta against Jack Perry. I think that would be very
Yep, that
interesting.
too. Yep.
Yeah. Another question from Azan here. He says, "I noticed the lack of blood on this show. Is it a good or bad thing in your world?" Um,
Good.
I think it's good. I think blood is overused in AEW, and I think it's best used sparingly. It's at its most effective when it's used sparingly. So I know Brandon talked a little bit about it, talking about the John Moxley match and how that's probably where you would have seen blood if you were to see some on this card. But I think the fact is on that you're asking about this means it stood out as different because there was not blood. So I think that's a good thing. Um, Brandon, I know we've bemoaned in the past the lack of blood on WWE shows when they were hell bent against using it, but I think AEW has shifted too far in the other direction. So I'm very much for I don't mind blood as long as it is used um, sparingly and to accentuate what's going on. And so the fact that they didn't use it here, I take as a good sign.
Yeah, like a lot of things with sliding scales of extreme. There are two extremes, and neither are good. I don't think that WWE's risk averse approach to blood was good. I don't think it was effective. I thought it took away from drama and their ability to tell compelling, heartfelt personal stories. And on the flip side of the coin, I thought that AEW's excessive use of blood was to a point of becoming nauseating, in the sense that blood just meant nothing anymore. It was like a gory horror movie. You saw it every which way. Everyone bled in nearly every match. Every pay-per-view was just filled with blood up and down the card. They're constantly replacing ring mats, and that was too much. It's not necessary. It's not necessary to tell all of your stories on the undercard, and it cheapens the opportunities you have to effectively use blood in major stories to tell compelling personal angles. So I have long advocated for AEW to dial it back significantly and WWE to dial it up moderately. And maybe this was an indication that we're getting both.
Finally, Azan asked, did it feel weird having an AEW pay-per-view without Tony Schiavone on the call? Schiavone lost his voice earlier in the week. I wasn't sure if he was going to be able to be on this show or not. He didn't end up making it, but I think AEW, and I do like how they rotate their announcers in and out the way they do. So, at various points we had Taz, we had Nigel McGuinness, we had on the pre-show Matt Menard, we had Jim Ross come in for the last two matches. So, I think the fact, Brandon, that they rotate their announcers as often as they do makes it harder to miss someone who would have rotated in and out with them. So I think they do a good job of doing that. And by the way, I thought JR was fantastic tonight. I thought this is the best use of JR at this stage of his career. Bring him in for the big matches where his voice carries weight and he's not going to get tired. He's not going to get worn down. He's not going to get, um, you know, as ornery as he can get on some of these shows with some of the matches he has to call that are not in his wheelhouse. So I think this
Over
is at this point.
ridiculous spots that are unnecessary at 8:40 on a 4-hour pay-per-view. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
I did not. I have to say this because if I say I didn't miss Tony Schiavone, it makes it sound like I'm being negative on him. But I think the fact that they do rotate their announcer so much makes it harder to miss an individual voice on these shows.
Yeah, I'm much in the same boat. I not to say that I didn't miss Shivani, and it was no his absence was notable in the sense that I certainly um, he's become really synonymous with the AEW brand in the same way that I think Excalibur has in a really big way, and so it was very much notable to not hear him on the show, but I didn't think it detracted from the show because I think that the guys that they had there did a solid job. I enjoy most of what Taz brings to the table. I don't always care for his the grumpiness, the grouchiness, and the sort of random musings, but I think he does a really excellent job at bringing weight and seriousness to wrestler strategy in the ring that is often missing from current commentary. Excalibur is Excalibur. He's going to do his thing. And then JR, like you said, really added to those two matches, and it was absolutely the right spot for him to be in on the card.
And then we have an email from JB from Detroit. His first question is he noted that opponents' finishers were used by both Hook on Jericho with the Judas effect and Swerve on Osprey with the Hidden Blade tonight. Should they have perhaps not done that twice on the same card? Look, I'm as critical of AEW's lack of oversight in these areas as anyone. But I think the fact that these two moves were done about 2 hours apart. They were not in back-to-back matches as we've seen previously in AEW. I wasn't. I don't think that's a big deal to me. Brandon, was it something that you would have gone out of your way to avoid?
It's a symptom of a larger issue, which I've discussed here on the post show before, where it does very much feel like there is a lack of oversight when it comes to AEW match production. But it was one of the least egregious examples that I think I've seen of that. If anything, I think you could actually point more to the number of submission finishes that they had tonight, and I'm not even necessarily dogging on that. I don't think it's necessarily a big deal one way or the other, but that stood out to me more than the double use of opponent finishers. But nowhere, I mean, neither, if you were to make note of them, were anywhere near as egregious or annoying to me as, for example, like what 8 out of 10 matches on Double or Nothing having interference.
Mhm. It wasn't as obvious as those moments either. Like, I mean, when you're talking one small moment within a larger match, it doesn't stand out as much either.
Mhm.
JB's other question: will we be getting Mercedes Monet versus Britt Baker at All In, or will the match be paid off at one of the bigger weekly TV shows between now and then? I think this is one of those matches you got to save for pay per view. I don't know whether it's going to be All In or All Out. I think one of those. And even then, it's like a month build seems very short for the the gravity of this match, which is two
They've
of the
got two,
biggest stars.
about two.
Yeah, okay. The biggest stars in AEW. So yes, I'm thinking for whatever reason the beginning of August, but it's the end of August, right?
Yeah,
Is when those shows
yeah.
are. Okay.
August
So that
25th. So they've got like
all right.
almost 2 months.
Oh my goodness, I don't know what I'll do without having to recap an AEW pay-per-view here in a month's time.
Don't
I'm
worry, you got
sure
SummerSlam.
I'm sure, yeah, I was gonna say, I'm sure we'll find something to talk about here. But yeah, that's I don't know. I wouldn't do it at TV. I would
No,
do absolutely do it on pay-per-view,
no.
but I think it's way too early to know whether All In or All Out is the best choice,
Mhm.
unless the big crowd is a real attraction to doing the biggest matches for AEW.
I think crowd reactions to the two of them facing off in the coming weeks in promo segments are going to go a long way in determining when they want to do this because I think, as was pointed out in the chat earlier on paper, it feels like a match that could be the first women's match to headline an AEW pay per view. And I'm not saying it gets there, but it's the first one that really has the potential to do that. And so, if that is the case, if they do think that they can get there with it, then I think you save it for All Out. But if not, if you have something very specific in mind for All Out for the main event of that show, then I would be inclined to get it on the biggest stage possible, which is going to be Wembley.
Another question from JB. He says, "Will the recently announced New Japan Dynasty show, the night after Wrestle Kingdom, be considered part of the AEW lineup?" I doubt it. It seemed pretty strong that it was a New Japan show. I'm sure AEW talent will be on there, as it was advertised on an AEW pay per view tonight. What I do hope is that it it eliminates the AEW Dynasty pay-per-view, which I doubt
Mm.
it will because that's money in AEW's pocket in a way that the New Japan Dynasty show won't be. Um, but yeah, I'm it seems pretty solid, Brandon, and that's a New Japan branded show that will likely have some AEW presence on it.
It felt to me like AEW or New Japan's version of Forbidden Door. So
Ah,
if Forbidden Door is the show where all companies are invited to come to AEW, then this is the show where companies are invited to come to New Japan. So
mhm.
I would expect that it will be at least somewhat similar in nature with a heavy emphasis on New Japan talent.
How will they pay off Osprey versus the Callis family, as he's already faced and beaten most of the family members? I that's the problem with Don Callis having so much of the heat, and that
Mhm.
heat not necessarily transferring. We talk about Takeshita and how over as a babyface he is. That heat that Don Callis is getting is not transferring to Takeshita. Um, and I actually thought that Kyle Fletcher was going to turn on Will Ospreay at the end tonight when he
Mm,
was helping him out
mm.
of the ring, because I believe it was Fletcher a couple weeks ago when Osprey made that offhanded remark that he didn't need the Callis family to win, and then the Callis family was shown watching backstage. Fletcher was the one that hung around after Callis left with the rest of the family, as if he was really thinking about what Osprey said. So I thought Fletcher was going to turn and attack uh, Osprey there, which would set up Fletcher versus Osprey, which would get Fletcher over as a big deal, which I think he should be because I think he has the potential to be a huge deal in AEW. But they didn't do that. So what's the answer here? What is the payoff? Is it Osprey Takeshita? Is it Osprey someone else? Is it the old school, Osprey gets 5 minutes in the ring with Don Callis if he beats Takeshita, for example, or something like that?
Yeah, it's a conundrum. They have an issue because you're absolutely right. I mean, the heat that Don Callis gets has not translated to anyone in the family. Konosuke Takeshita is by far the biggest client that Callis has, if we're discounting Will Ospreay, because he's never really felt like part of the family anyway, except in name. So if you figure that Takeshita is the biggest client that he's got, well, he's getting babyface reactions already, and Osprey has beaten him decidedly. So Osprey's beaten Kyle Fletcher too. So where do you go from there? I mean, yes, he can face Trent Beretta, but Trent Beretta doesn't feel like he's got that much heat behind him outside of the Orange Cassidy stuff. So yeah, it's an issue. I mean, do you not pay it off at a match and you pay it off in, Osprey hitting a hidden blade on Callus or something, or do you do something of that nature? I'm not sure. Obviously, from a match quality standpoint, if they want to bring this to a pay per view, the only one that really feels like it's pay per view worthy and worth Osprey's time would be a rematch with Takeshita. But you have to end up in the same place there. Osprey has to beat Takeshita and avenge the situation and formally declare his split from the Callis
Mhm.
family. So it doesn't do anyone any real favors. We have already seen Osprey beat Takeshita. Takeshita doesn't need to take another loss like that, and so you wind up largely in the same place that you're in right now. So I guess the only thing then would be to do what you're suggesting, which is have sort of a brutal beatdown and attack from Kyle Fletcher on Will Osprey, and then if you're going to do that, that to me is a match that you pay off as a big main event of Dynamite, not on pay per view.
Mhm. Two more questions from JB real quick. He says, I thought overall the show was pretty good, but outside of Britt Baker's return, do you think it could have used a few bigger moments? Um, Maybe. Like I wouldn't turn him down, but not every pay-per-view has to be chock full of huge moments or big returns or anything like that.
Yeah.
I think the last pay-per-view, may have overdone it, and I think the more big moments you do, the less big each one of them feels. So I was that's probably the least of my concerns about this pay-per-view tonight.
Yeah, I don't think you wanna condition your audience to expect, crazy returns, debuts, hot shot angles every single pay-per-view, because, that's you're gonna I mean, it's an impossible, situation to be in, and there's no way that you don't wind up with diminishing returns at that point. I think that they went, like you said, Greg, a little bit too heavy on it last month at Double or Nothing, and I think it was smart to pull in to rein it in a little bit tonight. I mean, there was a while there where it really felt like they were trying to recapture the magic of 2021 AEW, which for a bit there felt like just like massive debut after massive debut and huge moment after huge moment, and it was pertinent then. It made sense then because of the signings that they had and what they were trying to accomplish at the time. But it's a different company now doing a different thing. And I know that like coming into this year, Tony said that he wanted to not redo 2021, but make 2024 the new 2021 or whatever his exact language was. And that was worrisome to me and a lot of people because I think it just meant that he was thinking about a lot of hot shot angles and returns and swerves, and they were doing a lot of that earlier this year. And so even though I didn't think this was the tightest or strongest show that they've had, I am appreciative of the restraint they showed overall.
And final question from JB. He says, "Did you think that Justin Roberts doing the ring announcements in both English and Japanese added anything to the show? As always, love the show and go VIP. pwtorch.com/go VIP." So Justin Roberts was not doing the ring announcing in both English and Japanese.
Yeah,
They had the New Japan ring announcer there to do it in
yeah.
Japanese. But look, I think if your concept is Forbidden Door and it's not just New Japan or just Japanese wrestlers, but it's wrestlers from all over the world. But I do think it gives it a different feel and it sets it apart from the other shows. And it does, in a small way, give the viewer the impression that this is something special and different from the other pay per views that AEW does throughout the year.
Yeah, it's a fine touch, and I understand why they do it. And remember that this is technically a co-promoted event between AEW and New Japan, even though it feels very much like a straight AEW production. I think that they having the New Japan ring announcer is sort of the least that they can do, considering they don't bring in like even the English commentators for New
Mhm.
Japan. Like it's strictly the AEW commentating crew, it's AEW production, it's the AEW entrance, it's the AEW ring and ring graphics. I mean, there's
Yeah.
very little New Japan presence on this show, despite being a co-promotion.
Well, let's transition talk for a few minutes about Money in the Bank. We don't have enough time to preview NXT Heatwave, which is also next weekend, is another show we'll talk about on that Money in the Bank pre-show. So if you watch Heatwave next week, you're more than welcome to send us an email, wnialivecast@gmail.com, because we'll be talking about that show. In addition to Money in the Bank, Brandon, the men's Money in the Bank match has Jey Uso, Carmelo Hayes, Andrade, Chad Gable, and LA Knight, with one spot left to be determined on TV this week. What's your take on that lineup? And anybody jump out to you as a head and shoulders above the others as a potential winner?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting field. I mean, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Carmelo Hayes doesn't strike me as a guy who has much of a chance to win, but I think he'll have an impressive showing. I think this is has a good chance to be a bit of a coming out party for him on the main roster, and I hope that that's the case. Um, Jey Uso feels like a an easy pick. They've certainly primed him for that position. He feels like someone who um, given that he's lacking any sort of real storyline momentum right now, he's easily a guy that you can put the briefcase on and have him go on that journey for a little while. But there are two things working against him in that respect. One, the fact that they do prefer heels to hold the briefcase for obvious reasons because of the nature of the cash in. And two, we don't know when Jay is going to be called back to action with the bloodline. The assumption, of course, is that Roman Reigns will eventually reunite with both Jay and Jimmy to take on the new iteration of the bloodline. And when that happens, it doesn't really make sense for Jay to be hung up with a briefcase. So unless it was something that they plan to utilize right away, that's kind of a detraction against him holding it. The only other guy I would bring up as having sort of a strong case to win would be if Drew McIntyre wins the triple threat match on Monday and advances to the ladder match. I think that there is a pretty clear path there for him to cash in and be screwed again by CM Punk, which deepens the
No,
rift
say it
between.
ain't so. We've
I
seen
mean,
this movie way too many times before.
yeah, but it's going through their head. You know that they've thought of it. I think a lot of this, the I like this match because I do think it's kind of unpredictable, and the reason it's unpredictable is because there's so much up in the air. When is Roman coming back to do this thing with the new bloodline? When is CM Punk going to be cleared? I think the answers to those questions are really important to where you go with the briefcase. The safest option, the other direction that you can go, is LA Knight. I mean, he's still very over with the crowd. He's a guy that you can have a lot of fun with the segments with the briefcase. He doesn't necessarily have to win the title, but I do think that he's sort of a dark horse option if they think that all of these other characters are committed to bigger angles coming out of Money in the Bank.
I'll also throw in Chad Gable. I
Yeah.
think with his with what he's faced, trying and failing to attain the Intercontinental Championship, with the drama that he surrounded himself with, given his treatment of the Alpha Academy, and what him holding the briefcase would mean. Does that give him more legitimacy in the eyes of the rest of the Alpha Academy? I mean, Otis shoved him, but it was a soft turn. It was not a hard turn on Chad Gable that a lot of fans were waiting for. Um, so I think him holding the briefcase would be very interesting and would add another
Mhm.
dimension to his relationship with the rest of the Alpha Academy. I don't necessarily believe that he should be a favorite to win, but I think him being in the match and just all these different iterations that we're talking about mean that this is kind of an intriguing group, with nobody really standing out right now above the others. Now we'll see when that to be determined spot gets filled, but
Mm.
I don't think we can say that for the women's, because they right now they have Io Sky, they've got Chelsea Green, Lyra Valkyria, Naomi, Tiffany Stratton, and again one spot to be filled. I think that's a very talented lineup, but I think, to me, Tiffany Stratton jumps out to me as the person who's most likely going to win it. You made the point, Brandon, that WWE likes to have heels hold the briefcase. They also like to transform the briefcase into the character of the wrestler who has it. And you can only
Mhm.
imagine the ideas that have gone through creative and wardrobe and marketing when it comes to the Tiffany Stratton briefcase and what that's
Mhm.
going to look like and how many they can sell. So, am I wrong to think that she's the one that stands out among that group as of now?
No, definitely not. I think she is the standout. I have wondered for quite a while now whether the very, very clear, pullback in her push and the sort of defocusing on her on television is a product of them preparing her for an obvious Money in the Bank win. So it seems like she comes out of nowhere because that is something they've done over and over again. That's a formula that they use very frequently when it comes to Money in the Bank is de-emphasizing a guy or girl just before they, strap the rocket to their back and give them the briefcase. So I've wondered if that is what has been going on with Tiffany Stratton here, or if the de-emphasis was directly related to that ill-fated post that she made. So I think the jury's still out on that. I'm not sure which of the two that it is. I tend to think that it might be a combination of both, but they think that the storm has passed and they are going to move ahead with what was pretty clearly a significant push for her. So yeah, I would consider her the favorite. To me, in this situation, if you want to talk about a baby face, just an underdog baby face coming up and getting the opportunity, Lyra Valkyria is clearly a favorite of theirs. They put a
Mhm.
lot behind her in her presentation on television, and having the significant endorsement from Becky Lynch and tying those two together has obviously been no mistake. And then if I were to name a dark horse that would just be a ton of fun, even if it didn't necessarily work out in the end, it's Chelsea Green. She could make for some great TV with the briefcase.
And you can imagine all the creative ways that would have her, like, accidentally win the briefcase, just like it somehow
Yeah,
drops, like,
yeah.
off the hook and into her hands or
Hmm.
something like that, you know?
Hmm.
Damian Priest defends his world title against Seth Rollins. The stipulations to this one, if Damian Priest wins, then Seth Rollins cannot challenge again for as long as Priest is champion. But if Seth Rollins wins, not only does he get the title, but Damian Priest is forced to leave the Judgment Day. Uh, we've been inundated with teases of Damian Priest exiting the Judgment Day for quite a while now. Is this the way you think to put the title on probably the biggest star on the brand in Seth Rollins, but also to move Damian Priest away from Judgment Day once and for all?
I'm gonna advocate for it. I've been probably PW Torch's resident Damian Priest hater, and I mean I say that jokingly because I actually like Damian Priest. I think he's a good talent. I just don't think that he is a world championship talent. I think that he's um, had a really impressive run with Judgment Day. He's helped that stable in a lot of ways. He is very, very important to that brand, to Raw right now, and he's necessary for them. But I don't think that his world title run has been a success. I don't think the way that they framed it has helped in any way. I don't think the opponents have helped in any way. Drew McIntyre was clearly going to beat him cleanly, and if not for CM Punk, he wouldn't be champion. The month prior, Jey Uso was clearly going to beat him cleanly, if not for the Judgment Day. And I understand that heel tactics and heels need to cheat to win oftentimes. But when you have a champion whose pedigree is already being called into question, I think it's really important that you try to establish them as a formidable champion. And they have not done that with Priest at all. So even without the stipulation involved, my recommendation would be go with your biggest star on the brand, go with Seth Rollins, and get yourself a big world title match at SummerSlam. Even if it means Rollins drops the title weeks later, I think Seth Rollins versus Gunther for the World Heavyweight Championship at SummerSlam is a much bigger deal than Gunther versus Damian Priest. That's a fine match on a B level pay per view, but this is the second biggest show of the year. And it gives them a reason to finally pull the trigger on getting Priest out of Judgment Day.
We don't often see multiple titles change hands on PLEs these days in WWE, but Braun Breaker versus Sami Zayn, I mean, yeah, it's hard to make an argument for Sammy to retain based on how WWE has booked Braun Breaker, unless
Mhm.
Sheamus costs Braun Breaker the match and we go in that direction for a feud, or someone else costs Braun Breaker the match and we go in that direction. But I mean, everything in Braun Breaker's booking to this point in WWE main roster points to him getting the IC title here. Is that your read on it as well?
Yeah, this is a pretty clear title change unless that they're going the delayed gratification route, in which case I would think that this is a DQ finish. I don't think that there is much of a chance at all that Sami Zayn pins Braun Breaker. I think if Breaker's not leaving with the Intercontinental title, it's because Sheamus and or Ludwig Kaiser get involved and give us a multi-person match for SummerSlam, where Breaker then probably wins.
And finally, Cody Rhodes, Randy Orton, and Kevin Owens against the Bloodline. Big Bloodline shakeup this past week on SmackDown where Paul Heyman was attacked and he refused to uh, side with Solo Sikoa and call him, um, you know, whatever the phrase. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm blanking on
Tribal Chief.
tribal chief, of course. How could I forget? Refused to call Solo the tribal chief, and was summarily attacked for that. So shake up in the bloodline. This is going to be, I jokingly tweeted, "There's only one match that can handle this: Anarchy in the Arena." Wrong company, but that's kind of the style of the match I would expect, where it's just a big uncontrollable brawl, and I wouldn't be surprised if they added some kind of no DQ stipulation or falls count anywhere stipulation this week on TV for it.
Yeah, they did something similar to this back at Backlash in 2022, I want to say, with the Bloodline and some combination of wrestlers. I forget, or it could have been. Yeah, it was 22 because it was in Providence. I remember that. It wasn't the Puerto Rico year. So they did something similar with a big 6-man tag match that wound up being excellent, and it was very much like the high octane brawl with a bunch of these wrestlers. So I think that's the route that they go. Uh, this is a cool situation. I mean, it's a rare occasion where a non-title 6-man tag match feels like a worthy pay-per-view match, and that's because you have a hot stable in the bloodline with New Blood and Jacob Fatu that people are really interested in, and the announcers are selling him like he is an absolute killer. And you have three incredibly over baby faces opposing them. It's just a really good position, and it's something that WWE is able to get away with right now because it's such a hot product. So it's going to be fun. I mean, if this is leading to what's been heavily rumored that Cody Rhodes is to face Solo Sikoa at SummerSlam, then I think that this is the opportunity for Solo to get a big pin, probably over Cody, but at the very least over Orton or KO. And given the position that Solo was in prior to this rise of the Bloodline 2.0, so to speak, I would be looking to really get Solo some one-on-one wins on SmackDown in the coming weeks over both Owens and Randy Orton. I think that giving him wins, especially over Orton, a guy who just doesn't take pinfalls that frequently, a legend of his caliber who can very easily absorb a loss to
Yeah.
Solo Sikoa. I think that's really important to making Solo feel like a credible challenger to Cody.
And just as a reminder, we'll have all of your Money in the Bank post-game coverage right here, wherever you're listening to or watching this, whether it's at pwtorchdailycast.com or the PW Torch YouTube page. I'll be along with a co-host for that one. But that'll wrap us up for tonight, just shy of 2 hours here on a Sunday night. Brandon, thank you for joining me to break down Forbidden Door. Before I let you go, this is your opportunity. Plug all that you do for the Torch for us.
Sure. So I cover both AEW pay-per-views and WWE premium live events for PW Torch. You can find my reports on both the free site and the VIP site. And then I also join Greg here on Wrestling Night in America after those AEW pay-per-views and WWE PLEs. And then I'm an occasional co-host with Wade on the Wade Keller Pro Wrestling post shows as well.
Wonderful. Well, Brandon, we'll talk to you again soon because the pay-per-views, the PLEs, they never end. So we have a lot of work to do here, and I appreciate you joining me and hanging out late with us tonight.
6 days from now, in fact, Greg, we'll be back on Saturday.
Yes, yes, we will. I'll mark it on my calendar so I don't forget. Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah.
And you can follow me on social media at Greg M. Parks. If you're a VIP member of pwtorch.com, you can listen to my VIP audio show called Greg Parks Out Loud. And you can read my column every week in the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter. Again, for VIP subscribers, pwtorch.com/go VIP. You can follow me on X at Greg M. Parks. And as Brandon said, we'll be with you next week after Money in the Bank. So don't forget to tune in then. Until then, this has been Wrestling Night in America.